there, internet people. How we doing tonight? Welcome to the new normal and totally unedited, 100% flying by the seat of our pants reading of Mary Trump's book, Too Much and Never Enough. Tonight we dig into part two of 5 parts. Yeah, with only 200 pages, that seems like a hell of a lot of parts. But that's okay. We're already about 25% through the book, believe it or not. So, only a couple more weeks left, and we'll get to the end of this and figure out what we think. Before I get started with the reading tonight, Monday, I showed up with a face mask. And as lovely as that was for all you guys out there, I did promise a small review, if you care. So before I get started, as a reminder, this was the Grown Alchemist Deep Cleansing Facial Mask with wheat germ, ginkgo, and cranberry. This mask purports that it is a deep cleansing clay mask formulated to detoxify the skin appearance while noticeably improving skin's firmness. Well, with those claims in mind, I can tell you that it did make my skin a bit softer, I think. I don't know if it left it visibly revitalized, although it did have a nice little bit of a glow to it. Nothing that I probably wouldn't have gotten from, say, moisturizing it, or using one of those really cool Korean face masks that I prefer. And this one had the irritating needs to wash it off. Now, it wasn't one of the gloopy ones. It didn't stick. It didn't have that weird residue problem like you get with the charcoal masks either. So it wasn't that difficult to rinse it off, but it did require a little bit of scrubbing. Exciting stuff, I know. Anyway, let's get to why you guys are actually here, shall we? Part 2, The Wrong Side of the Tracks, Chapter 5, Grounded. Since September 1964, Donald had been living at the house and commuting 30 minutes to Fordham University in the Bronx, his attendance at which he'd avoided mentioning in the years to come, going from the regimented life at New York Military Academy to the relatively relaxed structure of college was a tough transition for Donald, who often found himself at loose ends and spent time strutting around the neighborhood looking for girls to flirt with. One afternoon, he came across Anna Maria, Billy Drake's girlfriend, standing in the driveway, watching her father wash the family car. Donald knew who she was, but they'd never spoken before. Anna Maria knew all about Donald from Freddie. As the two of them were chatting, she mentioned that she had gone to a boarding school near New York Military Academy. "Which one?" he asked. When she told him, he looked at her for a second and then said, "I'm so disappointed that you went to that school." Anna Maria, who was 3 years older than Donald, said, "Who are you to be disappointed in me?" And that ended the conversation. His idea of flirting was to insult her and act superior. It struck her as juvenile, as if he were a second grader who expressed his affection for girls by pulling their hair. Fun. Nice to see that he's changed, right, guys? So much change. He's grown so much. With Freddie's apparent fall from grace, Donald saw an opportunity to take his place as the father's right-hand man at Trump management, having learned his lesson to be the best, even if in ways his father hadn't intended. Donald was determined to secure a degree commiserate with his new ambitions, even if it only secured him bragging rights. Fred knew nothing about the relative merits of one college over another. Neither he nor my grandmother had gone to college, so the Trump kids were essentially on their own when it came to applying to school. Aware of the Wharton School's reputation, Donald set his sights on the University of Pennsylvania. Fortunately, even though Mary Ann had been doing his homework for him, she couldn't take his tests, and Donald, worried that his grade point average, which put him far below the top of the class, surprise, would scuttle his efforts to get accepted. To hedge his bets, he enlisted Joe Shapiro, a smart kid with a reputation for being a good test taker, to take his SATs for him. That was much easier to pull off in the days before photo ID and computerized records. Donald, who had never lacked for funds, paid his buddy well. Not leaving anything to chance, he also asked Freddie to speak with James Nolan, a friend from St. Paul's, who happened to work in Penn's admission office. Maybe Nolan would be willing to put in a good word for Freddie's little brother. Freddie was happy to help, but he had an ulterior motive. Though he never saw Donald as competition or thought he was out to replace him, he also didn't like to be around his increasingly insufferable younger sibling. It would be a relief to have Donald out of the way. In the end, all of Donald's machinations may not have even been necessary. In those days, Penn was much less selective than it is now, accepting half or more of those who applied. In any case, Donald got what he wanted. In the fall of 1966, his junior year, he would transfer from Fordham to the University of Pennsylvania. My grandfather completed the purchase of Steeplechase Park for $2.5 million in July 1965, a couple of months after I was born. A year later, Trump management was still struggling to get the approvals and zonings it needed to move ahead. They were also battling public opposition to the project. Freddie told his friends that nothing had changed since his previous stint in Trump management. Fred's constant micromanaging and lack of respect for his son made what could have been an exciting challenge a grim, joyless exercise. Failure, it went without saying, would have been a disaster. Freddie still believed, though, that if he had a hand in pulling the development off, he'd be on a much better footing with his father. That summer, my parents rented a cottage in Montauk from Memorial Day through Labor Day so Dad could escape the pressure cooker in Brooklyn. Mom planned to stay with me and Fritz full-time, and Dad would fly back and forth on the weekends. The recently renamed JFK was a 15-minute drive from the Trump management office, and Montauk Airport, really just an airstrip and an open field, was right across the street from the cottage, making it an easy commute. Freddie's favorite thing to do was still fly his friends to Montauk and take them out on the water. By the time the summer was over, my grandfather's plans for Steeplechase were in peril, but he knew it. Fred had been counting on his longtime connections to the Brooklyn Democratic machine, which had eased the way for so many of his developments in the past. By the mid-1960s, however, his political cronies were falling out of power, and it soon became clear that he wasn't going to get the rezoning he needed. Nevertheless, he made Freddie responsible for the near impossible, making Steeplechase a success. Time was running out. Suddenly, my father, at 28, had a more public role giving press conferences and arranging photo ops. In one picture, my dad, thin and in a trench coat, stands in the foreground of a warehouse, empty and cavernous, staring off into the vast space, looking small and utterly lost. In a last-ditch effort to circumvent a push by local residents to have Steeplechase declared a landmark, which would have halted the development in Scullow's plans, Fred decided to host an event at the Pavilion of Fun. Pavilion of Fun. Can I just go there? Does it still exist? Can we just all go to a Pavilion of Fun? Leave 2020 behind us? Maybe? I don't know anymore. Sorry, just living there for 1 second. Now to continue. Let's see here. The purpose was to celebrate the park's demolition. What? Guys, come on. You want to destroy a park of fun? In other words, he would destroy what the community was trying to save before landmark status could be secured. No kidding. It's like a family fucking trait. He had my father give a press conference in order to announce the plan, making him the face of the controversy. The extravaganza featured models in bathing suits. Guests were invited to throw bricks, available for purchase, through the iconic windows featuring an enormous image of the park's mascot, Tilly, and his wide, toothy smile. In a photograph, my grandfather holds a sledgehammer while grinning at a bikini-clad woman. The entire spectacle was a disaster. Good. Sentiment, nostalgia, and community were concepts my grandfather didn't understand, but when those windows were broken, even he must have conceded to himself that he had gone too far. Due to local rebellion against his project, he was unable to secure the zoning change he needed and was forced back out of the Steeplechase development. The venture exposed his waning ability to move the ball down the field. Fred's power was largely derived from his connections. In the early to mid-1960s, there was a significant changing of the guard in New York City politics, and as many of his old connections and cronies were losing their own power in places, Fred was beginning to get passed by. he would never again pursue an original construction project. Trump Village, completed in 1964, would be the last complex ever built by Trump management. Unable to accept responsibility, much as Donald would later be, Fred blamed Freddie for the failure of Steeplechase. Eventually, Freddie blamed himself. It didn't help that Donald drove back to the house from Philadelphia almost every weekend. It turned out that he wasn't any more comfortable at Penn than he had been at Fordham. The work didn't interest him, and it's possible that he suddenly found himself a small fish in a big pond. In the 1960s, NYMA had been at the height of its enrollment, a little over 500 students in grade 8 through 12, but Penn had several thousand when he attended. At the military academy, Donald had survived the first couple of years as an underclassman by using the considerable skills he'd acquired growing up in the family house. His ability to feign indifference in the face of pain and disappointment, to withstand the abuse of the bigger, older boys. He hadn't been a great student, but he'd had a certain charm, a way of getting others to go along, and with that, back then, well, he wasn't entirely grounded in cruelty. In high school, Donald had been a decent athlete. Asshole. Sorry. Athlete. A guy some people found attractive with his blue eyes and blonde hair and his swagger. He had all the confidence of a bully who knows he's going to get what he wants and never has to fight for it. By the time he was a senior, he'd had enough cachet with the fellow students that they chose him to lead the NYMA contingent in the New York City Columbus Day Parade. He didn't foresee any such success at Penn and saw no reason to spend any more time there than he had to. The prestige of the degree was what really mattered anyway. During the most crucial juncture of the Steeplechase deal, its unraveling, and its aftermath, Donald did a fair amount of armchair quarterbacking. Freddie, who had never developed the armor that might have helped him withstand his father's mockery and humiliation, was particularly sensitive to being dressed down in front of his siblings. When they were younger, Donald had been both a bystander and collateral damage. Now that he was older, he felt increasingly confident that Freddie's continuing loss of their father's esteem would be to his benefit, so we often watched silently or joined in. My father and grandfather were conducting a steeplechase post-mortem in the breakfast room that, on Fred's side, was acrimonious and accusatory, and, on Freddie's, was defensive and remorseful. Blech. Defensive and remorseful. Yes, those words. Donald casually said to his brother, as though completely unaware of the effects his words would have, "Maybe you could have kept your head in the game if you didn't fly out to Montauk every weekend." Freddie's siblings knew that their father had always disapproved of what was now merely Freddie's hobby. There was a tacit agreement that they wouldn't talk about the planes or the boats in front of the old man. Fred's reaction to Donald's revelation proved the point when he said to Freddie, "Get rid of it." The next week, the plane was gone. Fred made Freddie miserable, but Freddie's need for his father's approval seemed to intensify after Marblehead, and even more after the demise of Steeplechase. He'd do whatever his father told him to do in the hope of gaining his acceptance. Whether he realized it consciously or not, it would never be granted. When they first moved into the Highlander, Freddie and Linda had been concerned that the other tenants would bother the landlord's son with their complaints. Now they found themselves at the bottom of the list when they needed to get repairs. The window in my parents' ninth-floor corner bedroom offered expansive southern and eastern views, but they were also vulnerable to strong gusts of wind. In addition, the Highlander had brought built-in air conditioners in every room that hadn't been installed properly, so condensation accumulated between the drywall and outer bricks whenever the AC was running. Over time, the built-up moisture seeped into the drywall, softening it. By December, the wall around the unit in my parents' bedroom had deteriorated so badly that a frigid draft constantly blew into the room. My mother tried to cover the wall around the air conditioner with plastic sheeting, but the Arctic air continued to pour in. Even with the heat blasting, their bedroom was always bitterly cold. The superintendent at the Highlander never responded to their request to have a maintenance crew sent up, and the wall was never repaired. New Year's Eve, 1967, and don't worry, I will address this in a minute. Don't worry. I have things to say. New Year's Eve, 1967 was particularly inclement, but despite the rain and the wind, my parents drove out east to celebrate friends at Gurney's Inn at Montauk. By the time they were ready to drive back to Jamaica in the early hours of New Year's Day, the weather had turned even colder, and the steady rain had become a downpour. When Freddie went outside to warm up the car, the battery was dead. Dressed only in his shirt sleeves, he got drenched trying to get the car to start. By the time he and Linda returned to the apartment and their wind-blown bedroom, he was sick. Between the stress of the last 2 years and his heavy drinking and smoking, by then he averaged 2 packs of cigarettes a day, Freddie was in bad shape to begin with. His cold rapidly worsened, and after a few days he wasn't getting any better as he shivered, wrapped in a blanket, unable to escape the drafts. Linda repeatedly called the superintendent but got no response. Finally, she called her father-in-law. "Please, Dad," she begged. "There must be someone who can fix this. Maybe from another building in Jamaica Estates or Brooklyn. Freddie is so sick." My grandfather suggested that she speak to the Highlander super again. There was nothing he could do. Okay, here's where I'm going to jump in. So, a couple of things here. First and foremost, who the fuck does this to their own son? Right? You have all the money in the world and you can't get a wall fixed. You can't fix an air conditioner. You're just going to let your sick son sit in a cold-ass bedroom because why? Because he, quote, failed you on a deal that you knew was going to go bad? That you gave to him because you didn't want the failure on your record and you wanted to be able to point at somebody and say, hey, you failed, you fucked up, now it's your problem, and now I disown you and put you in a cold-ass bedroom with a faulty wall? With your grandkids in it? But even more importantly, what kind of human being sits there and takes it? Right? Why would you do that? You have your wife and your kids. Grow a sack of balls and call your own handyman. You know? Just do it. Get it done. Don't wait for permission. Fuck, worst case scenario, you get evicted. He's doing you a favor at that point. Right? No? Anyway, because so long their life had been lived in the confines of Fred Trump's domain, it didn't occur to either one of them to hire a handyman who wasn't on Fred Trump's payroll. That wasn't how it worked in the family. Fred's permission was sought whether it was needed or not, and the wall was never fixed. Now, here, I'm going to jump in one more time and say this is the one problem I have with this particular author writing this book, right? Because she has familial ties, and because she is, of course, Freddie Trump's daughter, he is painted with a very, very broad and very, very rose-colored paintbrush. Don't make excuses for him. He is just as much at fault here. Right? Yeah, sure, the grandfather may have contributed to things a little bit, and a whole lot, right? But you can only spend so long blaming somebody else for turning you into a 2-pack-a-day smoker who drowns his sorrow in alcohol to the point where you lose a number of jobs after working super hard to get them, to land in a derelict apartment with your children even though you have enough money to buy a fucking airplane? Anyway, we continue now. A week after New Year's, Linda's father called to tell her that her mother had had a stroke. My mom didn't want to leave my father, but her mother's condition was serious, and she needed to fly down to Fort Lauderdale as soon as she could arrange childcare. Not long after, Gam called my mother to tell her that Freddie was in Jamaica Hospital with lobar pneumonia. Linda immediately got into a plane and took a taxi straight to the hospital as soon as she landed. Now, who's Gam? I don't remember that person being mentioned anywhere else, so who the fuck is Gam? My father was still in the hospital on January 20th, 1967, their 5th wedding anniversary. Undeterred by his poor health and worsening alcoholism, my mother sneaked a bottle of champagne, real fucking helpful lady, and a couple of glasses into his room. Regardless of what was happening around them or what state her husband was in, they were determined to celebrate and keep those heads real deep in the sand. Dad had been home from the hospital for only a few weeks when Linda got a call from her father. Her mother was doing better after her stroke, he told her, but he hated leaving her at the mercy of nurses while he put in a full day at the quarry. The stress of work, the expenses of his wife's care, and the constant worry about her were taking their toll on both of them. "I'm at the end of my rope," he said. "I don't see how we can continue." Although Linda didn't know exactly what her father was implying, he sounded so distraught. She was afraid he meant that both he and her mother would be better off dead and, out of desperation, might do something about it. When she told Freddie about her parents' precarious situation, he told her not to worry and called his father-in-law to tell him he was going to help out. "Quit your job, Mike. Take care of Mom." Money wasn't an issue, at least not then. But derelict house and living under your father's thumb and being a dipshit. But Freddie wasn't sure how his father would react when he told him. "Of course," Fred said, "that's what you do for family." "My grandfather believed that in the same way he believed it was appropriate to send your kids to college or join a country club. Even if it was no interest to him or wasn't particularly important to him, it was simply what you do." Do a lot more damage than that. After the steeplechase deal collapsed, there was less for Freddie to do at Trump Management. He and Linda had been planning to buy a house since my brother had been born, and now, with extra time on their hands, they started to look for one. It didn't take long for them to find a perfect 4-bedroom on a half-acre lot in Brookville, a beautiful, affluent town on Long Island. The move would add at least a half hour to Dad's commute, but a change of scenery and the freedom of being out of his father's building would do him some good. He assured the real estate agent that he could meet the asking price and getting a mortgage would be no problem. When the bank called a few days later to tell him the mortgage application had been rejected, Freddie was stunned. With the exception of his 1 year with TWA, he'd been working for his father for almost 6 years. He was still an executive at Trump Management, which brought in tens of millions of dollars a year, free and clear. In 1967, the company was worth approximately $100 million. Freddie made a decent living. He didn't have many expenses, and there was a trust fund and a vastly dwindling stock portfolio. The most plausible explanation was that Fred still burned, but why he considered his son's betrayal and reeling from the failure of Steeplechase and intervened in some way to prevent the transaction. I just don't understand why somebody with that much money would need a mortgage. Or, maybe he really just was declined. My grandfather had prominent contacts and enormous accounts at Chase Manufacturing, Hanover Trust, and the other biggest banks in the city. So not only could he guarantee that Freddie could get a mortgage, he could just as easily make sure he didn't. Our family was effectively trapped in that rundown apartment in Jamaica. I don't know. I can buy that Fred Trump was a dick. I mean, he raised some pretty awful kids. I mean, there's really no way around it. And even if they weren't entirely awful people, they had some seriously awful problems, right? And I'm not entirely sure that his legacy isn't going to just keep oozing its way through time, right? Because, Ivanka and Eric and Don Jr. exist. But to put all the blame on one person when it is so obvious that Freddie was just self-immolating himself is real hard for me. I don't know. Maybe you don't agree. Maybe you think I'm being too harsh. You know what? I could be being too harsh. Let me know. Tell me. Tell me I'm wrong. Anyway. When June rolled around, my father was more than ready to spend the summer in Montauk again. My parents rented the same cottage, and with funds he raised by selling some of his blue chip stock, Dad bought a fucking boat with a 16-foot tuna tower, which was more suited to handle the kind of deep-sea fishing he loved. He also bought another plane, this time a Cessna 206 Stationaire, which had a more powerful engine and a larger seating capacity than the Piper Comanche, because that makes sense when you're declined for a mortgage and your kids are sleeping in a house that's missing a wall and has mold in it and water damage, and it was making you so sick that you almost died. Let's buy a boat and a plane. But the new toys weren't just for recreation. Dad had a plan. After Steeplechase, he had been increasingly sidelined at Trump Management. So he came up with an idea. I'm sure this is going to be great. of chartering both the boat and the plane to create another source of income. If it worked out, he might be able to free himself from Trump management after all. So he hired a full-time captain to run the boat charters. But on weekends, when doing so would have been the most lucrative, he had the captain drive him and his friends around instead. Oh, brilliant! That's gonna succeed. That's gonna succeed, right, guys? Right? That's how you make a successful business happen? When Linda joined them on the boat, she noticed that Freddie always drank more than everybody else, just as he had in Marblehead, which spurred increasingly intense fights between them. The increasing frequency with which Freddie flew under the influence was alarming, and as the summer of 1967 proceeded, Linda became reluctant to get into the plane with him. The unraveling continued, and by September, Dad realized that the plan wasn't going to work. He sold the boat, and when Fred found out about the plane, he got rid of that too. At 29 years old, my father was running out of things to lose. Yep. So that happened. All right, guys. Well, tomorrow's a new day. Hopefully I'll be able to get this camera rolling, and we will jump into chapter 6. Until then, stay sane. Try and avoid the news. Mwah.